For more than 2 decades, Joel Osteen has stood on the stage of the largest church in America, smiling, upbeat, promising his congregation that better days were always just ahead. He built that message into one of the most recognizable religious brands in the country, a televised empire watched by millions every week. But in recent years, the same qualities that made Osteen famous, the polish, the positivity, the reluctance to dwell on anything uncomfortable, have started working against him. A pandemic-era loan controversy, questions about where the church's money actually goes, a hurricane response that still hasn't been forgotten, and a shooting inside his own sanctuary have all chipped away at the image he spent a lifetime building. This is a story of how Joel Osteen got here, and why, at least for now, things aren't looking good. Joel Osteen was born on March 5, 1963, in Houston, Texas, one of 6 children in a household built entirely around faith. His father, John Osteen, had left traditional Southern Baptist ministry years earlier to found something different. After Joel's older sister Lisa was born with a severe disability, John and his wife Dodie turned toward faith healing and charismatic Christianity. And in 1959, they founded Lakewood Church inside a converted feed store that seated only a couple hundred people. By the time Joel was a teenager, that small congregation had grown into thousands of weekly attendees. Unlike his siblings, Joel didn't gravitate toward the pulpit. He preferred working behind the scenes, and after a brief stint at Oral Roberts University studying radio and television, he dropped out without finishing a degree. In 1982, at 19 years old, he returned to Houston to build Lakewood's television ministry essentially from scratch. For the next 17 years, Joel Osteen was a person making sure his father looked good on camera, producing, directing, and editing broadcasts, so he could compete with polished network television. He had no formal theological training and, by his own account, resisted every invitation to preach. That changed on January 17, 1999, when Joel finally agreed to deliver his first sermon. 6 days later, his father died suddenly of a heart attack. The son who had spent nearly 2 decades avoiding the spotlight was thrust into leading a congregation of thousands almost overnight, with no preaching experience and, by most accounts, no real plan for what came next. What followed was one of the fastest expansions in modern American religious history. Within 5 years, weekly attendance at Lakewood roughly tripled, and the church needed a bigger home. In 2003, Lakewood struck a deal with the city of Houston to lease the former Compaq Center, the old arena where the Houston Rockets had played NBA basketball. The church spent tens of millions of dollars renovating the 16,000-seat arena, adding new floors, broadcast studios, and classrooms, before opening its doors in the summer of 2005 to a completely full house. Lakewood eventually purchased the building outright in 2010. By the mid-2000s, Lakewood's television broadcasts were reaching a huge share of American households and audiences in more than 100 countries, making Osteen one of the most watched religious figures in the world. His approach was deliberately different from a traditional fire and brimstone sermon. He rarely spoke about sin or judgment, focusing instead on hope, self-belief, and the idea that God wanted people to prosper. Critics dismissed it as shallow. Millions of viewers found it comforting. That message translated directly into publishing success. His 2004 book, Your Best Life Now, became a genuine cultural phenomenon, spending years on bestseller lists and eventually selling millions of copies worldwide. It kicked off a business empire built on books, speaking tours, and eventually stadium events branded as Night of Hope, which sold tickets and packed arenas across the country and later internationally. Osteen has said publicly and repeatedly that he has not taken a salary from Lakewood since 2004, with his personal wealth instead coming from book royalties and speaking fees, an arrangement various outlets have estimated puts his net worth somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars. Joel met his wife, Victoria, under fairly ordinary circumstances, at a Houston jewelry store where she was helping out at her family's business while studying psychology at the University of Houston. They married in 1987, years before Joel ever stepped into the pulpit full-time. Victoria, raised in a Church of Christ household with a mother who taught Sunday school and a father who worked as a deacon, gradually built her own public role at Lakewood, launching the church's women's ministry in 2003 and eventually becoming a best-selling author in her own right. The couple's 2 children, Jonathan and Alexandra, grew up inside the world their parents built, both taking on visible roles in the church's worship and media operations as they got older. For years, one criticism has followed Osteen more persistently than almost any other: the gap between his message of abundance and questions about how Lakewood's own resources are distributed. Because churches in the United States are not required to file the same financial disclosures with the IRS that other nonprofits must file, exact budget breakdowns for Lakewood are difficult to independently verify. But based on publicly reported figures and the church's own statements over the years, watchdog groups and journalists have repeatedly noted that only a small fraction of Lakewood's overall spending goes toward direct missions and outreach, with the bulk of its budget instead supporting weekly services, television production, and large-scale events. Critics argue that structure reflects a media operation more than a traditional charitable ministry. Osteen and his defenders counter that producing globally broadcast services and hosting free stadium events is itself a form of outreach, simply one that looks different from a soup kitchen or a shelter. That tension became national news in 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic forced Lakewood to suspend in-person services. The church applied for and received roughly $4.4 million to the Federal Paycheck Protection Program, a fund created primarily to help small businesses keep employees on payroll during shutdowns. A church spokesperson said the money covered paychecks and health benefits for Lakewood's roughly 350 to 370 employees during a period when donations had dropped sharply. Osteen's critics saw it differently: a church with a massive annual budget and a pastor worth tens of millions of dollars taking federal relief funds originally intended for struggling small businesses. The backlash was significant enough that, about 10 months after receiving a loan, Lakewood repaid the entire amount in full. The church maintained that neither Joel nor Victoria personally received any of the funds, since neither has drawn a salary from Lakewood since 2004. The criticism of Osteen has never been purely financial. His entire preaching style, often described as prosperity gospel, has drawn sustained pushback from more traditional theologians for decades. Osteen rarely discusses sin, repentance, or hell in his sermons, focusing instead on self-improvement and positive thinking framed in spiritual language. Prominent critics, including theologian Michael Horton, have argued that this approach strips Christianity down to something closer to motivational speaking, warning that a gospel focused primarily on personal success risks leaving out central Christian concepts like grace and repentance entirely. Osteen has responded to this criticism directly in interviews over the years, generally arguing that his goal is to meet people where they are and offer hope rather than condemnation, a framing that has clearly resonated with millions of viewers even as it continues to frustrate many of his fellow pastors. No single controversy has stuck to Joel Osteen quite like his church's response to Hurricane Harvey in August 2017. As catastrophic flooding overwhelmed Houston, Lakewood initially posted on social media that his building was inaccessible due to flooding, even as images circulated online appearing to show dry streets near the church. The backlash was immediate and fierce, amplified by public figures and neighbors pointing out that other local businesses had opened their doors to evacuees right away. Osteen and the church pushed back, later providing photos showing flooding in and around parts of the building, and insisting the doors had never truly been closed. Lakewood did open as a shelter and donation site within days, but the damage to Osteen's public image had already been done, and the story became a permanent reference point anytime the church faced a new crisis. That history resurfaced in July 2024, when Hurricane Beryl slammed into Houston area, leaving more than 1 million homes without power during a brutal summer heat wave. This time, Lakewood moved more quickly, opening as a cooling center and distributing tens of thousands of bottles of water along with food to residents in need. Even so, the Harvey comparisons were inescapable. Social media users openly joked about whether Osteen would lock the doors again, and memes mocking the church's past response circulated widely even as Lakewood's relief efforts were underway. For an organization with Lakewood's resources and reach, it seems that 7 years later, plenty of people still hadn't forgiven or forgotten 2017. Then, in February 2024, Lakewood faced something far more serious than reputational damage. On the afternoon of February 11th, a 36-year-old woman named Janessa Yvonne Moreno walked into the church wearing a trench coat and carrying an AR-15 style rifle, along with her 7-year-old son. She confronted an unarmed security guard, forced her way inside, and opened fire in a hallway just before the start of a Spanish-language service. Off-duty law enforcement officers working security at the church exchanged gunfire with Moreno and killed her. A 57-year-old bystander was shot and survived. Tragically, Moreno's own young son was shot in the head during the incident and required multiple emergency surgeries, spending weeks in critical condition before eventually being taken off a ventilator. In the aftermath, investigators revealed that Moreno had a documented history of mental illness, including schizophrenia, along with a prior criminal record, and that the rifle used in the attack had reportedly been purchased legally just months earlier. Texas does not have a red flag law that might have allowed courts to intervene and restrict her access to firearms despite that history. Osteen addressed the congregation in the aftermath, urging people to hold on to their faith and not shrink back, and said he was praying both for the victims and, notably, for Moreno herself. Some in his congregation found comfort in that message. Others, including members of the child's family, said they wanted to see concrete action on gun access and mental health support rather than words about moving forward, a tension that had continued to surface in the broader conversation about the shooting. Underneath all of these individual controversies sits a broader challenge that Osteen and megachurches generally are now grappling with: a shrinking audience for the traditional Sunday morning model altogether. Survey data in recent years has consistently shown church attendance dropping sharply among younger Americans, with only a relatively small share of millennials and even smaller share Gen Z reporting regular attendance, numbers that researchers describe as historic lows. Younger generations, by most accounts, are gravitating instead towards smaller communities, more direct forms of activism, and a general skepticism toward large, highly produced religious institutions, exactly the model Osteen spent decades perfecting. That shift creates a real long-term problem for an organization built around scale: massive weekly attendance, expansive television reach, sold-out arena tours, a media-driven, prosperity-focused message that worked brilliantly for cable television audiences in the 2000s doesn't automatically translate to a generation more interested in intimate small groups and causes they can act on directly. None of this means Joel Osteen's ministry is collapsing. Lakewood remains the largest congregation in the country by weekly attendance. His broadcasts still reach a global audience, and his books continue to sell. But the accumulation of controversies, financial questions during a national emergency, the still unshaken memory of Hurricane Harvey, a lawsuit-adjacent shooting inside his own church, and a broader generational shift away from the kind of ministry he built has undeniably put pressure on the brand in a way that didn't exist a decade ago. Osteen's entire public persona has always rested on unshakable optimism, the idea that no matter what happens, better days are coming. The real test now is whether that message can hold up under scrutiny the same way it has always held up on stage. For an increasing number of observers, both inside and outside his own faith tradition, the answer isn't as clear as it used to be. What do you think? Has Joel Osteen's message stood the test of time, or is his brand of ministry running out of road? Let us know in the comments below.